We are live.
Good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Exam School Admissions Task Force. Because this is a remote session, I will ask Ms. Parvex to call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Contempasis. Mr. Acevedo, Ms. Aguirre, Mr. Charnov, Mr. Kreger,
Present.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom, Ms. Grassa,
Here.
Ms. Lam,
Present.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Present.
Ms. Garrett,
Present.
Dr. Tang,
Present.
Ms. Wade, Ms. Sullivan, and Mr. Contempasis.
Present.
Thank you.
We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali, Arabic, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Click the icon to select your language preference. Our Spanish interpreter this evening is Randolph Dominguez. Will you please invite our Spanish-speaking audience to switch to the Zoom channel in Spanish?
Hello, good evening, Mr. Contempasis. Good evening, board members. I will now proceed to introduce the interpretation in Spanish. Muy buenas noches, damas y caballeros. Mi nombre es Randolph Domínguez. Voy a ser su intérprete simultáneo de la noche de hoy. Para poder accesar el idioma español, van a buscar en la parte inferior de su pantalla un globo terráqueo. Allí van a pulsar y van a seleccionar el idioma español. Si están utilizando un celular, buscar en la parte superior derecha 3 puntos, pulsan allí y seleccionan el idioma español y podrán escuchar esta interpretación en manera simultánea. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
Thank you. Our Cape Verdean interpreter is Josanne Lopes. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Cape Verdean?
Thank you, Mr. Contempasis. Good evening, everyone. Boa tarde, meu nome é Josiane, seleciono os intérpretes para que reunião ali, para ter acesso à interpretação simultânea. Nos clica no ícone de globo na parte inferior do nosso ecrã e seleciona Cabo Verdeano. Se nós estamos usando o telemóvel, nos clica no 3 pontinhos na parte superior do nosso ecrã. Se nós tem alguma dúvida, nos coloca no chat. Obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Portuguese interpreter is Christian Leitner. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Portuguese?
Hello, good evening. Oi, boa noite. Eu sou Cristiane, intérprete de português brasileiro. Se você precisa de interpretação para essa reunião, quando eles ativarem os canais, você vai ver na parte inferior da sua tela um globo. Você clica ali e escolhe o canal português. Se você estiver assistindo essa reunião por um celular, você tem que ir até a parte superior direita e você vai ver 3 pontinhos, clica ali e escolhe o canal português. Obrigada.
Thank you. Our Vietnamese interpreter is V. Lee. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Vietnamese?
Good evening, everyone. My name is V. I will be your Vietnamese interpreter for tonight. Kính chào quý vị, tôi tên là Vi. Tôi sẽ là thông dịch viên của quý vị ngày hôm nay. Xin quý vị nhìn vào màn hình. Ở dưới màn hình có các quả cầu và xin bấm vào đó tìm tiếng Việt để có thể nghe được thông dịch viên nói chuyện. Cảm ơn rất nhiều. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cantonese interpreter is Terry Yin. Please give the Zoom instructions in Cantonese.
Thank you. 大家好，我係 Terry， 我係你嘅廣東話翻譯。一陣咧，你喺嗰個屏幕下邊咧就可以見到一個地球儀嘅圖標，你點下地球儀嘅圖標，選擇Cantonese 就係廣東話，你就可以入到廣東話啦。咁如果你係用呢個手機或者係 iPad 上嚟嘅話咧，你可以喺屏幕下邊點下嗰3個點，再揀呢個 Cantonese 亦都可以入到呢個翻譯嘅頻道啦。OK， 唔該晒 ，Thank you。
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter is Wei Li. Please give the Zoom instructions in Mandarin.
Thank you. 大家晚上好啊，我是你的普通话翻译李伟啊。如果你今天需要普通话的翻译呢，请点击屏幕下方的地球仪，到时候会出现，然后呢选择中文啊 Chinese 中文这个频道，而不是普通话频道啊，中文频道，然后呢就可以进入到这个频道听我的翻译。如果你是通过手机或者是平板电脑的话呢， 是点击3个点，3个点同样也是进到中文的这个 Chinese 中文的频道，然后可以听我的翻译。好，祝大家都晚上都愉快。Okay, back to you, Mr. Content Pass.
Thank you, sir. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Nadia Souli.
Hello everyone, bonsoir tout le monde. Nom c'est Nadia Souli. Moi c'est interprète pour créole haïtien à soin. Donc si vous avez une question, pas oublier faire me connaître pour moi cadio et pas oublier peser sur globe là qui c'est créole haïtien. Mais c'est que moi va apporter un bon service à soin pour. Merci. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our Arabic interpreter is Marouana Benaoum. Please give the Zoom instructions in Arabic.
السلام عليكم، أنا اسمي مروانة بن نعوم، سوف أكون مترجمة اللغة العربية لهذا الاجتماع. من فضلكم إذا كنتم بحاجة إلى ترجمة، الضغط على الأيقونة على شكل كرة أرضية أسفل شاشتكم واختيار اللغة العربية. شكرا. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Somali interpreter is Fatima Hassan. Please give the Zoom instructions in Somali.
Mr. Content Passes, I apologize. She had to cancel.
Okay, thank you. We also have American Sign Language interpreters, Andrew Pidkameni and Charlotte D. Spingston. Thank you all for assisting us this evening. We will now activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to remind everyone this evening to speak at a slower pace to assist our interpreters. The next item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from the June 4th, 2021 meeting. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented. May I have a motion, please?
I so move.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Hearing none, Ms. Parvex, please call the roll.
Thank you very much. Mr. Acevedo? Mr. Chernow?
Here.
Mr. Kreger?
Aye.
Ms. Grassa?
Aye.
Ms. Lam?
Aye.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Aye.
Ms. Garrett?
Aye.
Dr. Tang?
Aye.
Ms. Wade? Mr. Content Passes?
Yes,
Thank you. It's unanimous.
thank you. I believe Ms. Hogan is on vacation. Is Ms. Roberts with us this evening?
I'm here.
Thank you. Do you know if we have any data that was requested to present this evening?
I don't believe so.
Okay. I did receive an email from Ms. Hogan. She will return on Monday, and she left us an address if there are additional requests that folks may want to make. Before we go any further, I'd like to give you an update as we proceed, given all the changes that may have occurred, have occurred since our last meeting. It is our intent to schedule a task force meeting for this coming Monday, the 14th, from 5 to 7 p.m. There will be a school committee meeting on the 16th, at which time we will present, Ms. Sullivan and I will present a status report of at least a minimum of 2 options that we have discussed this evening and in the past to the committee to give them an update of our thinking. We will then have a task force meeting on Thursday, the 17th, from 5 to 7. We had tentatively in the past scheduled, in conjunction with the school committee, 2 listening sessions. Both of them are on hold pending further communication from the school committee. They were tentatively scheduled for Monday, the 21st, and Wednesday, the 23rd. We will then have a task force meeting on the 24th from 5 to 7. It is Ms. Sullivan's and my hope that on the 24th, we'll have finalized our recommendations to present to the school committee, either by consensus or if necessary, by vote, the recommendations that we wish them to reconsider or to consider on their meeting of the 30th. It is not clear yet whether the committee will vote on the recommendations on the 30th, or whether there will be a special meeting called during the first week in July to consider the vote. Both Ms. Sullivan and I have indicated to the school committee that waiting until the 21st is not an acceptable issue for the two of us for a whole host of reasons. So we're hopeful we will get consensus when the school committee reconvenes on the 16th. That is the schedule, and hopefully we will, by the 24th, which gives us, I believe, 3 sessions, to come up with a set of recommendations that we either have reached by consensus or, if necessary, have taken a vote in order to present to the school committee. Are there any questions about that? Hearing none, we will move on then to the discussion of possible criteria for admissions. And again, as was the case on the meeting of the 4th, we probably should begin by discussing 3 areas. One is the eligibility for the applicant pool. The second is to how do we segment the students? And the third is how do we agree on seat allocation? There are a number of other recommendations which have been made, but these 3, I believe, are the ones that have been discussed and require, in my mind, further clarification and further direction as to what the majority of the committee wishes to do. So I'd like to begin by suggesting we review the possible options that have been discussed around eligibility for the applicant pool. Nothing is off the table. We have not decided anything yet. We may have disagreement on some of the terms, but they are still open for discussion. Dr. Tung, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Before we get into the discussion, I was hoping to just review Dr. Shepard's recommendations, because task force members have referred to her comments as proposing the use of MCAS, and this is not the case. So I rewatched her session of that meeting, and just a selection of things she said. Grades are a better predictor of future academics than test scores. Tests have a greater disparate impact than selecting on grades alone. Tests reflect unequal opportunities like test preparation and stereotype threat. Tests cement inequity. About the MCAS, she did say that it was a better measure than MAP growth test, and that if we use the MCAS to improve fairness, we should set the cut score low for eligibility and use lottery for selection. She said we shouldn't choose a test just because it is uniform, because uniform isn't always the fairest. So just wanted to address the comments I've heard in the last couple of meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tung. Is there anyone who has a question for Dr. Tung? Okay. moving forward, I will make an attempt to suggest what the options are for each of these areas that hopefully will generate conversation. I believe these are the options. And again, the intent this evening is not to reach closure. It is to at least get a sense of whether indeed we can reach consensus on this issue, or whether indeed we need to ultimately vote on our preference. As I understand it, the eligibility, and by the way, I am open to correction if need be. The eligibility for the applicant pool, my way of thinking, falls into a series of options. The first option that we've discussed is to use a GPA only, and there has been discussion around limiting the terms to the 2 terms beginning this September for 6th grade only. I believe we have discussed whether we should use math and English language arts, or whether there is a feeling that those 2 subjects need to be, that others need to be added to those 2 subjects. The use of an assessment, namely the MAT, is also on the table. And I would suggest that the 2 areas of discussion is whether we use an absolute score, which the test vendor has indicated to us that they can provide. That test score would be equal to or exceeding what the mass standards are around meets and exceeds expectations, the state standards. So we would look for an absolute score, which could be used in some manner with the GPA. There would be a discussion necessary around whether we give a weight to each of those 2 factors. We also have discussed using the MAT test to determine a threshold limit to determine the eligibility of the applicant pool. That the test vendor would give us, in essence, a cutoff score, a threshold, above which every applicant would be considered. We could then utilize the GPA, B or better, to determine the order in which the students might be selected. We have talked about adding an essay. We've discussed educator support. We have also discussed utilizing an lottery across the district on the basis of the eligibility of the applicant pool, either determined by option A, which is the assessment and the GPA, or strictly the GPA. I'll stop there. There may be additions, subtractions, disagreements, but that to me is where we have landed in terms of determining the eligibility requirement. We have talked about growth, using growth, and using the test for achievement purposes, as I've discussed above. We've discussed why there is a problem with growth, in the sense that the district does not mandate the MAP test. There would be difficulty logistically because the students who reside in the city of Boston, who do not attend a BPS school, there might be difficulty in having to take a pre and a post test. And there also has been discussion about the shortness of time between when the test would be given I would assume as soon as school began, and then later on, when everyone would sit for the exam as is typically given in November. Is there anybody that wants to add or disagree or offer some other suggestion around eligibility? I would ask one of you at least to keep track of the order that the hands go up, as I have difficulty doing so. I'll start with Ms. Lum, Mr. Krager, and then Mr. Chernow. That's all I see for the time being. Mr. Krager, I'm sorry, Ms. Lum.
Thank you, Mr. Contempassus. I just have a question of clarification with regards to the GPA and rank system we used this past year in the interim policy. And that's with regards to the 20% citywide when it was GPA and rank. Was that utilizing overall GPA and overall rank? Or was that again, so for example, could someone have gotten a B- in math or ELA and not the B threshold, meaning they could have had a 3.7 GPA, but just didn't get the B in math and or ELA, so they would not have been qualified to begin with and would not have been included in the pool, even if they had an overall rank that could have led them to be a higher achiever in the school.
I believe that what we stated was that it would be B or better. I don't think this is really a question for Ms. Hogan.
I can try to take that, Mr. Contempassus, if you like.
Sure, please do.
So we used the combination of the 2 ELA and 2 math scores, and then those combined developed your GPA, so your overall GPA. It's unlikely that someone had a C or lower across scores. I won't say it's not possible, but it does reflect the overall GPA combining your ELA and math scores.
Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Krager.
So I wanted to just say this. At this stage in this process, my only real interest is in developing a plan that fulfills our charge and results in meaningful neighborhood, socioeconomic, and racial diversity in our exam schools, but does so clearly within the bounds of the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent on this matter. Namely, does so in a manner that cannot be accused of racial balancing. To me, I can accept an approach that involves a lottery, an approach that involves a test, an approach that involves no test. I would only note at this time that if a test is used, I would think we should make it as flexible as possible, such that if a student, per Dr. Shepard's testimony, could demonstrate their eligibility to attend an exam school based on their performance on the MCAS, I would not need to see them do the same thing on another test in order to be assured that they could perform well in school. So I would think being able to prove yourself in different forms would be an appropriate way to widen the pool.
Thank you, Mr. Chernow.
Thank you. My question is a two-part question. The first part being, I know others on the task force had mentioned earlier about in prior meetings about using more than just English and math in the 6th grade when we look at their GPAs. Do we have an answer to whether or not all BPS high schools, or sorry, middle schools teach those courses?
They all are required to teach English language arts and math 5 days a week.
but we don't know about social studies or science.
I don't believe some may, others may not.
Okay.
Are you sure?
That
I would say as a principal, that would surprise me that a sixth grader was not, I mean, I've worked at 4 different schools in BPS, all of which have had middle schools, and they all had all those content areas. So that would surprise me if that was not the case. I will say some places have gone to a humanities model, which is the social studies and the ELA combined. But other than that, I would be very surprised to hear that about a middle school.
okay. It certainly is true of the elementaries. I think you would agree.
Yes, elementary is different, but I do think middle school is different.
Okay,
And
then,
again, Mr. Cherno?
sorry, I was just gonna say, if that's the case, then I'd be open to looking at all 4 of those grades for the 6th graders, and as well as maybe even seeing some of their 5th grade grades as well. That could only be the 2 subjects, just to get more of a chance of like having one teacher that doesn't like you, or one bad term, or you had something going on, to give you more flexibility in terms of proving yourself in multiple instances.
Ms. Skerritt?
Thanks. Piggybacking on Mr. Chernow's question, just trying to learn more about different members' recommendations so that we can try to get to, as Mr. Kreger described, some concrete options. So I guess one question for Ms. Lum, and maybe Mr. Chernow answered this a little bit with his recommendation just now, is would you just mind sharing a little bit more about what the benefit in your view is of expanding to other subjects? I have similar nervousness about the level at which the other courses are offered and across school types. And I think it's helpful to hear Ms. Grassa say that these subjects are likely offered at every 6th grade. But that leads to just my other question about, are we building something that is COVID provisional again, or not? I understand if we're saying 6th grade grades this year because of all that's gone on, do we need to have a conversation about 5th grade on a normal year? Because I think that does impact thinking about subjects used and some of those other pieces. Similarly, with thoughts about MCAS, this year was very unusual for grades 3 through 8. We had some students testing remote. We had some students testing remotely. And so with that, with Mr. Kreger's suggestion around using MCAS as an equivalent, I just wonder whether that might be affected by the unusual way that the test was taken by students this year amid so many disruptions. So I guess my question though is for Ms. Lum to hear more about the recommendation of other subjects. I guess I'm thinking of some schools where a teacher might teach the entire school in a subject. And, how often are they receiving assessments? How much do those grades reflect differentiation amongst the students, just things like that?
So I guess I would answer your question with a question myself, which is, are you saying then if someone scores a 3.75 is in the top 20% in school A is not the same as someone who scores 3.75 overall GPA in another school and is also in the top 20%? Those two students are not equal.
I don't know about the value of the student. I think my recommendation around an assessment from the beginning is that even within BPS, there doesn't seem to be much opinion that grades are the same from school to school. So if that's what you mean, then yes, I guess I'll give a specific example of a science course, for example, in a K-8, where there may be one science educator responsible across the school. serving an extremely high number of students. So that teacher's approach to grading may certainly be much different from someone who has science as a departmental subject more frequently, for example.
So my pushback would be that as the task force purview is criteria alone and not how the correct criteria was arrived at, I would be looking at overall GPA and achievement purely through that lens. And if the criteria is not an effective measure across schools, that is a district issue and a pipeline issue. It is not a task force issue.
Okay, I only think it's a task force issue if it could potentially disadvantage students by some aspect of their identity or school type that they attend. So in that way, I do think.
I think we could balance that out with school criteria then that had been discussed as well in terms of how resourced the school is and where we might place weights. But I think if we're trying to avoid gaming, so to speak, the more variables we can include in eligibility, the more fair we are across the board. Because I think by not including other coursework and other achievements, you are limiting students still to the same limitations that you're discussing in terms of quality and access to opportunities, even if it's just around ELA and math.
Okay, so that answered the first part of my question, which is what do you see as the benefit of adding additional subjects? And you feel like it's a fairer representation because there are more folks inputting into that collective grade average. Thank you.
Mr. Acevedo.
I sheepishly put my hand up, my cyber hand up, and brought it down. I guess it's just very close to, but oh, here it is. So close to what Mr. Krieger shared. And I, and I am congealing around thoughts around an assessment and lottery and which and what grades into what weight to give. But I'd rather wait to see, if some of that ground, if I'm willing to give some of that ground and be persuaded otherwise in this discourse. What I will say though, Mr. Contemposis, to your framing remarks at the beginning, living in the realities now of obviously of Boston and I think the projected urgency around the work of this task force. We're in a different kind of, there's a different kind of placement around the importance of consensus to this task force than there was maybe even 2 weeks ago. Consensus, I believe now, is essential. Consensus is not optional. I believe that the only way we can deliver a recommendation to the Boston School Committee that will result in a permanent and equitable admissions policy to the city's exam schools would be as expressed through the consensus of this body, precisely because we come from such different places. It's precisely for that reason we're on this task force, and we represent a city that's awfully divided on these things, and like never before. We can't give ourselves the pass on the hard work of achieving consensus. It must be through consensus now.
Thank you. I agree with you. I just don't realize that, I just don't think on all of these issues that we will be able to get there. I too would like to reach consensus as we did with the work group. But when we have disagreement or differences of opinion, not disagreement, around, for example, what should the GPA consist of, when we all know that we've had a pretty difficult year. And even though in sixth grade, science may be offered or social studies may be offered, I would wager, Ms. Grassa, that the program offered at one school in the district is not consistent with perhaps in another. And yet the work of this task force is not to solve that problem. And so to me, the focus on language, arts, and math is because those two have been the most consistent across the grade levels in the district. Ms. Grasser, I see your hand up.
I mean, we have a middle school science curriculum, and we have like kits across the district. Like, I don't know. I personally think science and history are things that are being taught in middle schools. And I think there is always too much of an overemphasis on just ELA and mathematics, which are obviously important subjects. But we have amazing scientists, amazing historians. I mean, if you're thinking about a classical education, if you're thinking about in some of our exam schools, that's a piece of it, and thinking about history studies, that's a huge part of an exam school education. But that's just my personal opinion, and from what I know about all of our other school leaders. And also, it's an opportunity for us to bring value to other subject areas that are also important and should be recognized. I also think one of our exam schools is for math and science. So to like O'Brien School of Math and Science, isn't that the name, Dr. Freeman Wisdom? I believe it says math and science in the title of your school name.
It does.
Yeah. Why wouldn't we want to elevate a subject that is like certainly a huge piece of one of our amazing exam schools? So that's just my thought on it. I do think it takes away the emphasis of like one teacher holding all the weight of a particular score, and for kids to be able to shine in some different areas. It also means that like, hey, if I'm not the best in math, but I'm really strong in ELA, science, and history, I still could be part of the eligibility pool to then potentially be accepted into an exam school. And that's my focus area to work on. But I truly think there is less inconsistencies as we move to middle schools. And
Well,
I probably have one of, if not the largest middle school in BPS, definitely one of. And most of my teachers teach a 1 grade level or 2 grade levels. I know in some of our smaller schools, I can think of like a single strand middle school, like someone is probably teaching science for kids for the same 3 years in that middle school. And so that would be slightly different, but they're still learning the same science content.
I think my in the spirit of trying to move this in the way that Mr. Acevedo has suggested, the rationale I think behind the English language, arts, and math is that historically 2 grades have been considered in this process, 5th and 6th. And since we're now debating whether we include science and social studies as part of the GPA, perhaps we ought to think about whether we do that, because we probably will have to deal with the issue of what semester grades are we going to use. If we were to use the 6th grade this year, because of the difficulties we've discussed during the previous year, then we might want to look at adding science and social studies, because all of the students would be submitting their sixth grade scores only. And, you know, I would question, I still question, forgive me, Ms. Grasser, but it may well be the case that you have every middle school teaching science, but until the facilities in the city equal what they should be, I don't think they're teaching it consistently. But I'm open to looking at expanding the GPA because of the fact that we're thinking about using only the first two terms of the sixth grade.
I welcome
What
you
happened?
any day to come watch middle school science at the Curly, Mr. Contenpasas.
Well, I'm sure the Curly does it well, Ms. Grasser, because you demand it. But let's move on. Mr. Chernow?
It's Dr. Tung. It's Dr. Tung then, Mr. Chernow.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Tung.
Thank you. So I agree with Ms. Lum that the more data points, the better, because it's a high stakes decision. So we want to give kids as many chances as possible. But I also understand that the 2021 school year is not one on which we want to, you know, base high stakes decisions on. So I was wondering, could our recommendation be a permanent one with a 1-year exception, where if GPA does become part of our eligibility requirement, could we say that the permanent one is 5th grade GPA and the first half of 6th grade, like it has been in the past? But I agree with the added subjects. While for the 22-23 admissions cycle, it's just the first half of 6th grade. All subjects, in my opinion, all subjects.
No, thank you.
Just speaking out of turn, but that sounds reasonable to me. I'd love to, yeah, but that sounds reasonable.
Mr. Chernow?
No, that also sounds reasonable to me. I think we should expand the subjects we look at for 6th grade, and also definitely think about having next year be another not permanent year due to the current situation. So I agree.
So if I'm hearing the group correctly, we may have reached consensus that the grades that will be included will consist of the student's performance in the first two terms of grade 6, but they will include math, language arts, social studies, and science for a 1-year effort that will then revert back to the use of 5th and 6th grades, which would require math and language arts to be the two subjects that determine the GPA.
Well, my only amendment to that is we have to come to consensus on this, the permanent 23 and beyond, because some of us think it should still be the cumulative GPA all combined, and some think it should just be ELA and math.
Can I make a suggestion related to that? I agree with Dr. Tung's proposal around having 2 stages of a GPA, a 1-year COVID provision and a long-term. It does sound as if we're likely going to do some analysis of that 1 year. It might be useful to see what we learned about the acquisition of science grades, social studies grades, how they affected students, et cetera, to potentially look at. I certainly don't want to suggest that we're back here ever again, but maybe it might be helpful to mark that as something as we revert to the other grade model to assess what the addition of those grades did, and to hear from BPS what the process of collecting, if the process of collecting those grades worked, if there were grades available for every student, if there were trends to who they weren't available for. Just might be useful as it's such a new element, and I don't know if they've, done that analytical work across the district at this time, and then also for non-BPS students as well.
Ms. Grassa?
Thank you. Yes, I support the 1 year and then the longer term plan. And I think even in the longer term, we can include all 4 subject areas in the 6th grade grading. One caveat I would say is, I know we're saying first 2 terms, but some BPS schools are on trimesters, several K-8s, including myself, whereas other schools are on quarters. So currently what happens is that if you're on quarters, the first 2 quarters count in 6th grade. And if you are on trimesters, the first trimester counts. So I would just want to make sure that language is really clear, whether you're on quarters or trimesters, in whatever we propose.
Is the same thing true of your 5th grade?
Yeah, my whole school is on trimesters, but it was a structural plan that the school made. And so several K-8s structurally, it helps you operate as one school more effectively. And so structurally we're on trimesters, but there are schools that are still on quarters.
Okay, good point. That will be included if we have consensus. Ms. Lum?
I want to say that I am in agreement that if we come up with another temporary policy for this coming year and then a permanent policy suggestion, that makes sense to me. I would also like to say, understanding where Ms. Garrett's concerns are with regards to whether or not we are advantaging or disadvantaging more or less children by considering multiple subjects. I'm wondering if perhaps maybe when we go to the permanent solution, we look at overall class rank coming out of the 5th grade. So not looking at subjects, not looking at anything other than where they rank, and then looking at math and ELA in 6th grade to accompany the class rank going into middle school, and their academic achievement in those 2 subject areas or 4 subject areas. I'm open to either because I prefer that, but for the sake of building consensus, this might be another permutation.
Mr. Acevedo, and then Ms. Grassa, I have a question about what just Ms. Lum just talked about. So bear with me for a minute. Mr. Acevedo.
Yes, just with respect to Ms. Lum's suggestion now, I want to make sure that we are talking about the same thing, but it's just a choice of terms, but I think a very important choice of terms. I don't think we're advocating, or at least I wouldn't be recommending a quote, a temporary policy for FY22 and a permanent policy for 23. This is a permanent policy that is phased. So we're looking at a multi-phased permanent policy. We have an initial phase for 2022, and then a longer term phase to begin in FY23, but we're communicating to the school committee. This is the permanent policy, because none of us want to be back next fall, I'm sure, to create another permanent policy, and we don't want to leave that door open.
Ms. Grassa, how do you compute class rank in the 5th grade?
We don't rank our 5th graders, so we don't do it at all. I would say the district, calculates the GPA for exam schools, but we don't at the school level. rank our kids.
So I guess, if I may, I've heard very clearly that we might possibly, whether it's trimester or quarters, for this year moving forward, we would use only the grades acquired from September through whenever the district asks for a GPA. That moving beyond that, since the practice has been to include the 5th and part of the 6th grade, can we at least, as Ms. Skerritt has suggested, look at what the result has been this year if we go ahead with what's been suggested, and utilize the fact that we think this is a pandemic solution, but that the practice reverts back to a 5th and 6th grade arrangement with math and language arts, reminding everyone that one of the recommendations we're making to the school committee is that all of these practices will be reviewed in either a 4 or 5 year period. I'm concerned about the fact that the 5th grade may not be, as Ms. Grassa has suggested, as far along, if you will, throughout the district in those other 2 areas as perhaps the 6th grade is. Ms. Sullivan, welcome. Your hand is up.
Indeed it is. And I've been listening to this excellent discussion. So I do, though, agree with Ms. Lum and Dr. What to do here. And I might, rather than just a little modification, Mr. Condon-Passos, to what you indicated, I might suggest that this year, you know, as was stated, we do the four subjects for 6th grade, and following that the policy would be that we include the 5th grade, perhaps 5th grade ELA in math, taking into consideration the inconsistencies across our schools. You know, we're using the district as a proxy here only because we don't have insight into other schools, but we know enough there to give us pause. So using 5th grade ELA in math and 6th grade for the 4 subjects as another possible solution here. Although I do really like Ms. Lum's suggestion, but can certainly understand that we might not necessarily want to encourage the ranking of 5th graders. So 5th grade ELA in math, 6th grade all subjects would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Dr. Tung?
I lowered my hand.
Okay. How much of this should we also reinforce the fact that perhaps it is time for the school department to change the way it grades 5th graders? Ms. Grasso.
So I believe the district is working. I know they have partnered with, and forgive me for not remembering the name. I know Monica Hogan has been working on this with the author of Grading for Equity, and I cannot remember his name off the top of my head, but they are started launching this work around how we are doing our work around grading for equity. And there will be 10 pilot schools next year chosen to begin to pilot this work across K through 12, and then ultimately, I would hope, expand. So I believe, I don't think it's our job to task and name how people grade, because we don't know how the other schools grade. But I think just knowing that we want to name that, we would want to make sure that all students will have equitable access into the GPA. There shouldn't be a discrepancy on how they have access into that.
Well, now I'm confused. Does that mean that you would not go along with Ms. Sullivan's recommendation?
Ms. Sullivan's sound
Yeah.
was going a little bit out on my end, so I
Well,
don't know if I'm disagreeing with her. I'm not sure.
No,
I can
okay.
repeat. Would you like, I can repeat. It's based, or if someone else who heard it wants to repeat it, it's fine. What I'm suggesting is, if we have, as you know, for 21, we agree that we should use the 6th grade math, ELA, science, and social studies, then my suggestion would be for 22, that we use the math and ELA from 5th grade and the math, ELA, science, and social studies from 6th grade.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's what I had previously said too.
Mr. Krager?
Ms. Lum, then Mr. Kreger, Mrs. C.
Thank you. Ms. Lum?
Thank you. I just want to, this is again perhaps more a clarification question than anything else. I know by strict definition, teachers are not ranking students, but tiering and ranking does go on because students are invited to AWC and students are not invited to AWC, and that happens at the elementary level. So clearly there is some recognition of some level of progress, achievement, etc., that is going on at very early ages. So I just want to throw that out there, that whatever considerations are factored into that determination is impacting the 5th grade as well. So there's that. And second, I also want to say, we haven't gone there yet, but I want to repeat that I'm not opposed to an assessment and utilizing an assessment. And if assessments are only ELA and math based, that will also help provide a guidepost in terms of consistency of ELA and math achievement and the word's escaping me, but grasp of the subject matter as well. And it can, by combining both a 5th grade GPA lens as well as an MCAS lens, I think, or whatever assessment test lens, you may be able to mitigate for those who do well in school, but not necessarily test well, or vice versa.
Mr. Krager?
Chiming in briefly to note that I support Ms. Sullivan's proposal, and I also support what I believe you were just suggesting, Mr. Contenpasis, that BPS change the manner in which it grades 5th graders. At least at this point, a standards-based grading system under which you would have to demonstrate you're performing above grade level, meaning you are doing things you haven't even been taught in order to earn the highest grade possible, makes me think we are putting our BPS students at a disadvantage in measuring them against their peers. And if anything, our job is to make that process as barrier-free as possible for all of our students. So I would support a change in the grading procedures for 5th grade as a result.
And I think, if I may, should we make that a recommendation of this task force? I mean, you can think about that. I don't necessarily need an answer. I mean, I know that Ms. Grassa has suggested that there is someone working on this, and, you know, it will hopefully come to fruition. But, you know, I do share your concern. I too can support Ms. Sullivan's position, but I worry about what happens down the road a piece when hopefully we're back to some semblance of normalcy and the 5th grade is now included here. Ms. Skerritt, and then Ms. Freeman Wisdom.
Thank you. I want to also echo support for what Mr. Kreger just said about moving specifically to letter grades in grade 5. It should be noted that some BPS schools already use letter grades in grade 5, which already creates inequitable practices. Those schools tend to have strong acceptance rates, stronger. That's a generalization, but I think it's factual. So I would support that recommendation. I did also I want to. Then I just wanted to note about the suggestion of ranking within schools, to just give a general worry that I have. I think I've talked about it before, of having a very small size of students who are competing with one another, as we've seen through this year's policy, worries me deeply. And with the number of schools involved and school types involved, all seeking exam school admissions, from homeschool to very small types of independent schools to large schools, I would, especially with the limited time left, encourage us not to look at pools that are even smaller than the small zip codes of this year. And for that reason, along with the reason of concern about the notion of ranking within schools, which makes me feel like that would not be good for school culture, I wouldn't recommend ranking at the elementary school level, even if just for this process within a school. I do support a rank within tiers or a ranking system for the overall admissions, but that's hundreds, thousands of students and not 7 students or 3 students or even 20. So I just wanted to mention that piece.
Ms. Freeman Wisdom, please.
Good evening, everybody. I was just going to say that I do agree with Ms. Sullivan's proposal, but I would add an assessment to it. And I do also agree with Mr. Kreger's recommendation in terms of the grading piece. Just want to put that out there.
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo.
Echoing Ms. Freeman Wisdom just now, as well as Ms. Lum earlier, and agreeing with Ms. Sullivan. I believe, yeah, to use use the additional grades, phasing them in, again, emphasizing this is one permanent policy in 2 phases, phasing them in as we've described. I also believe, Mr. Contenpasos, I agree with strongly that we should recommend, even as part of, you know, the recommended policy to the school committee, that BPS does shift the way they grade in 5th grade, and that is within the purview of our charge. I do believe that it is within the purview of our charge to make that recommendation, and that we should.
Okay, I'm going to take the liberty of the co-chair here and see if we can reach consensus on what the language should be regarding the design for this coming year regarding the GPA. What I've heard is that we will use either the quarters that some schools use, or the first trimester that others use for this coming applicant pool. We will include in the 6th grade the addition of science and social studies to the English language arts and math that's been used in the past. We will recommend that the district revert from a number system to a letter system in grade 5. And then moving forward, we will, for purposes of the second phase, if you will, 5th grade will be English language arts and math, and 6th grade will be the 4 subjects. Have I captured all of that correctly? Mr. Acevedo, I think you're, or is it Dr. Tang?
I'm sorry, I neglected to lower my hand. My hand's down.
Okay, Dr. Tang.
Just to Mr. Acevedo's point earlier, maybe we should word it, we recommend, and then do your second part, and then just say the 1-year exception due to COVID is, and then say your first part, so that it really is a permanent proposal.
Okay.
I agree with that.
I also agree and wonder if we need to be very clear about the quarter versus trimester. For the quarters, you have 2 terms. So is it the average of terms 1 and 2, or the singular trimester term? I think we just need to be clear, since we're comparing 2 different systems and timelines. I'd love Ms. Grass's opinion on that.
So I agree with that. Can I just real quickly, I agree with that. The only thing I will flag is that, you know, we are not presenting a final recommendation this week. We have a couple of weeks at the very least to work through the details on the language here. So I might suggest that perhaps if there's I did join late, so I do apologize. I might suggest that we try to tackle one of our other more meaty subjects, decision points perhaps, and be able to come to some consensus on something else tonight. And we can kind of work on the language over the next probably 3 or 4 meetings. I don't know.
I agree. And I think you can also defer to how they do it now, because they already do that in the.
They average the 2.
I don't know if it's the average. I think so, but Monica Hogan would be the best person to respond to that. But I would say, what is it that's currently happening? And we could just also adopt that language.
Okay. Mr. Krager and then Dr. Tang.
A quick footnote, just to say that when we talk about a permanent plan, it's got to be a plan that is limited in scope, at time and scope, and subject to periodic review. Meaning we can take the input that we get from the student climate surveys that we've talked about. We can look at the impact of the admissions policy on the racial, socioeconomic, and neighborhood diversity of our schools. We can ensure that rigor is being met, and then use those things to help us decide if we need to modify the plan. A pedantic footnote that I'm going to stop right now.
Thank you. Dr. Tang?
Read that.
I didn't know which other meaty subject folks wanted to tackle next, but I have one that I have a suggestion for the groupings that I'm thinking might be non-controversial, so we could like check it off. But if folks want to do test or no test, I'm good with that too.
I'd love to start the assessment conversation. I mean, we need to just get it done. So I know it's easier for me to say because I'm not on video right now. So, but I mean, if we can.
Yeah, my intent, Ms. Sullivan, was to, as you remember during the presentation with the Equity Roundtable, we sort of broke it down into eligibility, segmentation, and seat availability. So
Yeah.
I had started with the eligibility requirement. We'll get to what Dr. Tung wants to talk about, but I agree. I think we ought to put the assessment issue on the table right now and listen to what people can live with and cannot live with. And that is probably one of the meatiest topics we will cover. So who would like to begin? I talked about the options around assessment, suggesting that we would use the MAP test either as an absolute score or an indicator or threshold. If we used it for either, it would be in combination with the GPA, as we have discussed it. And that leads us to not only trying to reach consensus on whether we use an assessment, but then we also have to take into consideration, it seems to me, what would be the value, if any, to either and or the assessment and the GPA. So the field is open, folks. Ms. Garrett.
Thank you. I'm jumping in because I apologize in advance. I have an event, virtual event at school that I cannot miss that begins in a few minutes. I think my position on an assessment, I've articulated many times. I would ask the question that I've posed a couple of times, which is that if not an assessment, if folks could identify what tool they're suggesting that would create some general indication of grade level work. I think that what we've heard, again, from folks close to schools is that our current grading certainly reflects students' efforts and certainly is an important and meaningful mark, but that a grade of any type, A minus, B, B plus, B, is not necessarily indicative of a universal program aligned to standards. We, as a working group, discussed at the last iteration of this that there was going to be some verification of that process at the school level. That did not take place for BPS schools. So I would just ask if folks are positing to not use an assessment. I'd just love to hear suggestions of what is indicating that a student is approaching, near, or at grade level as compared to state standards.
Forgive me, but I don't see any hands. Perhaps
I will definitely watch the recording and read any and all minutes of this part of the conversation. I am very sorry to have to leave, but this is an important week for my school. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess to me, I just don't know how we can rely on a GPA with all of the things that we have discussed with the work group and beyond, knowing full well that there isn't a perfect system out there one way or the other. To me, the use of an assessment is necessary because everything else we use up to this point is subjective in nature. And from my perspective, and you may consider me a dinosaur, but that's the way it is. The assessment to me is essential. But what's essential with it is to try to equalize what we've discussed in the past as gaming for students in the BPS who don't have access, whether it's simple communication to parents or whether it's giving them the enrichment kinds of experiences in the areas that they have not been exposed to, and making that up as part of the school experience. So my own position, so that it prompts discussion, is that we use the assessment in conjunction with the GPA as we discussed it. And that assessment would be indicative of an absolute score that then would require us to possibly try to reach some consensus, A, on whether we do that, or B, whether we assign a specific rating to the GPA and the assessment. And I'll leave it at that. Ms. Sullivan, your hand's up.
Thank you. So two things. So one, you know, I've shared with the task force previously my concerns about utilizing assessments in this way based on the research, not based on how I feel or what I think, but based on the research that has been done in this space. And so I am really, you know, it causes me to reflect on Dr. Shepard's presentation to us a few weeks ago, specifically her comments. You know, she begins from a position of, you know, really looking at other ways to assess a child's readiness to learn in these environments. And she did provide some factors for our consideration. I would encourage everyone to review her presentation. That said, she then transitioned into, I think it actually came perhaps during our Q&A session with her. She then shared with us, again, based on the research, not based on how anyone feels, but based on research and data. She then shared that the best indicator in these types of processes really is the GPA. And she shared with us that the research states that, or supports that, the use of an assessment, if it is to be used in this type of situation, is best used as a validator for what the GPA may tell us. Now, that all assumes at the base level that the goal is to truly identify those students who are at grade level and not to use the assessment as a tool in order to weed students out. So if what we're trying to do is identify those students who are at grade level and prepared to enter these learning environments, then if there is an assessment, I would be inclined to suggest that the GPA is the leading indicator, and then the assessment is used as a tool to validate what the GPA is telling us, and in our case, can also serve as a normalizer, given that we have so many different types of sending schools involved here. So that's one. Second, I am absolutely opposed to using an assessment that is looking at an absolute score, especially in the fall of 21. There is absolutely no way that we can expect students who have had over a year, nearly a year of interrupted learning, multiple learning environments, difficulty accessing learning environments, to show up in the fall of 21, sit for a high stakes test and say, good luck. We can't do that, that's not fair. And so I also, and that is my feeling, but I'll go right to the data once again. When NWEA presented to us, they shared with us that that the math growth has not been used for this type of in this way, and they shared that it would be best to use it as it is intended as a growth measure. And so in the best interest of
You're breaking up, Ms. Sullivan.
children, I think we should be looking at growth. So in the best interest of our, based on what NWEA shared with us about their assessment, I do believe we should be looking at growth as a consideration. And I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Acevedo?
There's much that Ms. Sullivan has shared that I agree with. First of all, I've come to the conclusion that some type of an assessment must be a factor in determining admission. I don't see a way around it to use, and I like the way Ms. Sullivan put it, as a normalizer in a field with so many distinct schools. I'm trying to get away from the phrase sending school, remembering a comment of Ms. Garrett's that truly, in the sense, these are not sending schools. This is just a pool. The pool of schools, I think, would be more accurate. The pool of schools from which our students come from. I am intrigued by the idea of, and also my recollection of Ms. Shepard's, Dr. Shepard's presentation. For me, the flashpoint really was near the end. And when we asked her to think specifically of the sets of circumstances and the multiplicity of the pool of schools from that our students for the exam schools are chosen from. She simply acknowledged you have a dilemma. So if she were here tonight, she would probably acknowledge the same thing. We're using her as authority, and the authority is telling us, well, you guys are in a bind. I'm glad I'm not you. So we're in the same place. You know, we answered authority. But one thing she did say is that the best possible world, and she even had a slide that demonstrated that the sweet spot would be a combination of grades and an assessment. Now, having said that, I am intrigued by the idea of using the assessment, the NWEA, as an indicator of growth. And if this could be a perfect world where we can make that happen. Now, Mr. Contempasis, you began your remarks tonight by saying that there were some sorts of, that there were practical concerns around it. And I want to understand that more. If there's, and also would love to hear more from Ms. Sullivan to see if perhaps she's already weighed those obstacles and have found ways for the district to navigate around them. But if there's a practical way that we could introduce the NWEA as, quote, a normalizer, I like that term, and B, as an indicator of growth, that all of our students, including the ones outside of the district, can appeal to, I think that would be the best possible of all worlds.
Well, my response to that is probably logistical more than anything else. To measure growth for this coming year would require at least 2 sittings for the exam. It would also require that the school committee mandate that all schools participate in the MAP test beginning this coming new school year. The time period for growth to be determined can't be the difference between September and when the students would normally take whatever assessment the district would offer. It also provides, it prevents charter school students, parochial school students that may be disadvantaged by the fact that it's not offered there twice and it's not offered at all. And so it may well be something for the future. But where we're worried about the students in this coming class and the difficulties they've had, I just don't think it's practical that the district can use the MAP test for growth purposes in that period of time. And so, you know, I revert back to what I've heard previously. I think that there possibly is some sort of agreement for an assessment. There may even be 2 options for that assessment. One, as we suggested, that it be used specifically to give us grade level standards for an absolute score, or it be used specifically to determine an absolute minimum threshold that wouldn't be used to determine any ranking of students, but would be used to indicate the readiness to enter the eligibility pool. So we're using a minimum level that would be equivalent to a B or better, or a meets or exceeds, whatever you want to call it. But it would be a threshold that would determine the readiness of the applicant pool, which would then mean it would not be used in any other way, and that the GPA would be used to rank the students, or else we'd go to some sort of lottery.
Mr. Contrapulsis, I realize there are other hands up. Just I was just wondering, with respect to Sullivan's suggestion of the growth, using NWEA's growth, and hearing you that there, particularly in the next year, that presents, you know, that presents logistical challenges. I'm wondering if there's some way that we could come to a phased solution, not unlike what we were able to just achieve with respect to the use of middle school grades. And perhaps the first phase of our phase permanent policy, that first phase would include, you name it, some way to, whether it's a continuation of what we've been doing up to this year, and then perhaps for school year 20, what will it be? School year 23, 24, introduce NWAA, phase it in as growth at that point. Agreeing that for this most immediate school year, it would pose a challenge, but phasing it in for future years would be my suggestion.
I'm not adverse to that, as long as that growth that's built over time, whatever a reasonable time would be, would indicate grade level readiness to enter the eligibility, the application pool. So, well, I'll leave it at that. And I've lost track. I think, Dr. Tang, you were being my helpful assistant here. Who's next?
I think Ms. Lum is next, then me, then Mr. Krager, then Ms. Grassa.
Okay. Ms. Lum.
Thank you. I was just going to suggest what Mr. Acevedo just suggested, which is we phase how we use assessments. So phase 1 could be an absolute score based on MCAS within BPS and perhaps MAP or equivalent outside of outside of BPS. And then for the phase 2, maybe this is overkill, I don't know, but I think this is partly my trying to understand how a growth measurement works. If I'm not mistaken, growth is relative. So you could have someone performing below grade level improve and have a good growth score, but still perform below grade level, correct?
Correct.
So if we want to really be comprehensive and look at a student's performance holistically, in addition to the GPA scenarios we've discussed, you could use MCAS as an absolute score for grade level threshold, B or better, and look at growth within that population of eligibility through the MAP MCAS score to, whether or not that's a necessary lever or not, to demonstrate the student's progress in addition to demonstrating their grade level achievement.
Okay, Dr. Tung?
So all research evidence confirms that tests cement the reality that there are winners and losers. Meritocracy entrenches inequality. I don't think this should be the case in public schools. But to contribute to the conversation, if what we're looking for is readiness to perform grade level work, what do you all think about for a minimum eligibility requirement to use GPA as we've discussed, or proficiency on the MCAS or whatever other test the non-public school folks want to take? If we do one or the other, then there would be no need for a phased approach, because this fall they would have GPA.
Mr. Krager?
I get it, and my first reaction to Dr. Tung's proposal is that I like it. Right? It's already there. Yeah, and so I'm actually going to sit and think about that rather than make the comment I was going to make. Please.
Okay, Ms. Grassa?
I want to just provide a little context about the growth and the window and space in between which you have to do it. It's my understanding that we can't do growth from like the end of 5th grade to the beginning of 6th grade. We would have to do growth at the beginning of 6th grade and then at the middle of 6th grade or at the end of 6th grade.
Mhm.
So just to name that, but thinking about like the timing and how that works. Also just to highlight that people have highlighted that you could have a really significant growth and not be anywhere near grade level. You could also have minimal growth and be reading at off the charts. So just to also name that other bookend, that you're a top reader and you're not making significant growth because there's just not that much further to grow. And so naming that as something to put out there.
So I actually I'm gonna take some co-chair privilege here because there was a question put out by Mr. Acevedo a few comments ago I'd like to respond to about kind of a couple of, and with respect to the logistics, certainly if we were to include growth, whether that is the indicator that is used as part of the process alone, or it is a scenario where, you know, it's one of a couple of options. The assessment would need to be given more than once, and it would need to be given more than once to all students or made available to all students. I want to just be clear that I was never suggesting that BPS students would have the opportunity to use growth and other students wouldn't. And so similar to how we currently create opportunities for students who are non-BPS students to take the assessment, to take, or how we did create opportunities for students to take the IC. We would do the same in this scenario. So that's one, it would be available to all students, not just BPS students. Second, we had require BPS to operationalize it. And so it would be incumbent upon BPS to determine the dates and the locations for these assessments. We know that BPS students typically would take the assessment during the school day. Non-BPS students would take the assessment at some other designated time. That is operationalizing the plan, and something that I do have. The larger question that is that last comment that Ms. Grassa made with respect to timing needed to assess. Oh, before I get there, the other piece I would state is that if we were to use growth, I am not suggesting that it merely be the demonstration of growth. What I would absolutely suggest is that there be an indication of grade level performance. I'm not just suggesting that a student demonstrates, rapid growth between, reading at a kindergarten level and then reading at a 3rd grade level. I understand from the school leaders their concern about students entering the schools who are not at grade level. I understand that is a significant concern for them. And so ensuring that growth does is able to tell us that a student is at minimum at grade level is critically important. I understand that. The last piece though, to Ms. Grassa's point about timing, that is an open question for NWEA at this point. If we were to use an assessment and if we were to consider growth, how much time would be needed in order, for example, could an assessment be given in September and then given again in December? Is that enough time? So that is an open question. And I would certainly want to receive data-driven analysis on that particular question if we were to move in this direction. The last piece I will state, and I hear the conversation, I'm not opposed to a phased approach if we are to use an assessment. However, I cannot overstate the deep concern that I have about asking Boston Public School students to sit for a test in the fall and they've got one shot, knowing that they are not on the same playing field as students who have been in classrooms for the last year at private schools and other types of schools. That is not setting our children up for success. I cannot overstate that concern. And so for me, it's about how do we solve for this coming fall if we are going to use an assessment. That is a major concern for me.
Well, I'll respond in a minute, but Mr. Acevedo, your hands up? No? Okay. Ms. Sullivan, I don't often disagree with you, but I just don't think that recommending a growth measure with 3 months of determination actually benefits the students any differently than it would if they're sitting for an exam, which is determining whether they are eligible for an application, I'm sorry, for an applicant pool. The use of the threshold, which would not count toward how a student is selected in terms of what school they end up with, is based on the issue that the vendor can give us a threshold which is the equivalent of a meets or exceeds on the MCAS state standards. These students are the same ones who just about a week and a half ago were taking MCAS. They're going to be at a disadvantage on that basis if we choose to use that score this year. So I think I have made it clear that my position is we need an assessment. But I do think I have moved to a point where I want that assessment, in my mind, to be what I just heard you say, grade level readiness based on a threshold score, which the vendor claims they can relate to the MCAS meets or exceeds. And then we would utilize the GPA as we did this past fall for purposes of choosing the students for the schools. But I still would suggest, without the assessment and moving to a growth factor for next year is impractical. It just cannot be done effectively, efficiently, and fairly across all of the schools in the district. Ms. Tung, Dr. Tung.
I'm just wondering why we're talking about the MAP growth test and not the MCAS when we know that both of them tell us grade level proficiency. And Dr. Shepard said that if we were to use a test, the MCAS would be better.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Dr. Shepard. I am suggesting that the same problem we have with trying to implement a growth assessment is similar to what the students were exposed to this year in BPS who had to take the MCAS. Maybe over time, when we looked at the data with the work group, the results on the MCAS for grade level were not very good across the board. And so we raised the same issue. Are we saying to the students in the parochials and the charter schools. I think the charters probably take the MCAS, but not all of the students that attend a school who are residents of Boston take the MCAS. So what are we going to do? Are we going to tell those students in those schools to do that? I guess I'm trying to be realistic here, folks. We keep hearing about Dr. Shepard, but Dr. Shepard hedged her bets. As far as I'm concerned, there is no perfect system here.
But we do
And I
have
think,
more.
if I may, I think I have moved off the needle and said, basically, we need to determine a mechanism that illustrates the readiness of the applicant pool. And the MAP test, according to the vendor, can give us that threshold score by relating it to the meets or exceeds on the MCAS. That's all I'm saying.
And we
I'm
have
not,
a lot more data.
who's next? Mr. Krager?
Well, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Ms. Tung was not finished. So I do want to give her an opportunity to follow
Oh,
up.
okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Tung.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind everyone that we have a lot more data around the quality of the MCAS for our students than we do on the MAP growth, and we have lots of reasons to be critical of the MAP growth, especially given that they were afforded plenty of opportunity to address our questions and didn't.
Okay, Mr. Krager, are you next?
Sure. Well, I think I share Dr. Tong's skepticism of the MAP growth, and I also recognize the practical reality that as yet the state does not allow the use of MCAS for students who are not in our public schools and being assessed in our public schools, meaning our traditional public schools and our charter schools. I think I'm going to state my support of the use of a test to determine grade level eligibility for a pool here. My thought would be, let's make this as reasonable as possible on our students, such that if they can or they have demonstrated that on MCAS, because they have to take MCAS, then they should be done, right? Similarly, right, they should have an opportunity to do that on MAP growth along with all of their peers who would be taking MAP growth for the first time in order to make that happen as well. I could support an approach that uses an exam to enter a qualified applicant pool and does it in a manner that gives students the chance to prove that proficiency in either of those ways.
Ms. Grassa?
I think Dr. Freeman Wisdom was before me, so
Oh,
wait.
I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. Sorry about that. Tanya, you're up.
All right, thank you. Really quick. I try to be always try to be straight to the point. The growth scores do not indicate grade level work. I believe that's something that Ms. Grassa stated, and I want to reiterate it. You know, you can have a high growth score, but not be on grade level, and a low growth score and be way above grade level. Therefore, I do believe that an assessment is needed to validate grade level readiness. And GPAs alone does not accomplish this goal. That's all I wanted to state. Thank you.
Ms. Grasso.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Freeman Wisdom. And I would also just add, like, with just, you know, MCAS, we could not validate this spring's MCAS. I want to name that. Kids were given different sessions to take. We don't know what we're going to get reported out on it. So I personally think that the MCAS for this coming year is not even something we can consider, just because the amount of families who just opted out or were remote and couldn't get on the internet or couldn't make it work. Like, I would say under no circumstance can we use this spring's MCAS scores. So just to name that for people. I also just want to name the concerning nature of MCAS previously with, there was a huge article just 2 years ago about the racist nature of a reading passage and questions asked of students. So I wouldn't say that it is a superb assessment by any means in terms of, just in terms of previous history.
So I appreciate you actually raising that, Ms. Grassa, and I just want to comment in response to it. We have significant research that suggests that high stakes assessments used in this way, in high stakes way, is actually supports structural racism. And so if racism is a concern for this body, if it is, I think that we should just acknowledge that even considering at this point using an assessment in this way would be us supporting, albeit in perhaps a small way, a structure, a process that, again, the research tells us supports structural racism versus, yes, we are all aware of the MCAS question that raised flags, but we can't be selective in our outrage on that.
Dr. Tung.
Given the conversation that happened between my proposal before and now, how about this? For a minimum eligibility requirement, we could use GPA or MCAS proficiency or the MAP growth test, the achievement part of MAP growth, so the one time. And we have the linking studies that show MCAS and MAP growth are aligned, and kids who don't go to public schools could figure out how to take the MAP growth. And people in Boston schools could either use MCAS or MAP growth or GPA.
Okay, so Dr. Tung, I appreciate that recommendation. And it's good to see you all, rather than just listening to your voices. You're suggesting multiple ways to get into the pool. I do think that could work, but I do want to go back to Mr. Contemposis just to make sure that I'm clear on your last comment on this subject. Did I hear you correctly in saying that we should consider using the assessment as a qualifier for getting into the pool, and then use the grades as the mechanism for seat distribution?
Yes, that the MAP assessment be used as a threshold indicator that the student is in the range that we have defined as B or better, or meets or exceeds. Yes, that's what I've said. And that's different than what I said an hour and a half ago.
I understand.
And so to me, the assessment is necessary.
I understand.
The readiness of the applicant pool, we have heard over and over again, although we may still have disagreement. We all looked at the MCAS scores of the students that will be entering this year who were in fourth grade when they took the MCAS.
Mm-hmm.
And those scores across the board for BPS students, in my mind, are totally unacceptable. Now, Ms. Grassa has clearly indicated the difficulty this year with the assessments, the MCAS assessments. And I'm certain there are people who are opposed to the MCAS as they are opposed to any type of test. And I appreciate that. And, you know, they're entitled to their opinion. But where I'm going with this is we need an assessment that will determine a threshold equivalent to be or better grade level standard.
So this is my response to that. And again, I will be, this is the hill for me. I'm looking at fall of 21. And if what I'm hearing is that there's a strong desire to use an assessment to determine whether the students who are in 6th grade are at grade level in the fall of 21.
Yep.
I have serious concerns about that. And my question is for us to really consider this. Do we really believe that in the aggregate, the 5th graders in Boston Public Schools this year are going to sit for an assessment in the fall of 21, and show up at 6th grade level?
They may be.
Surely there will be some, but let's get real on this. And I'm serious, like, wait, let me finish. I want to be clear. This right here is the hill for me.
Yep.
Now, if we want to talk about what happens after this point, after 2021, we want to talk about 22, I'm fully open, but this is the hill because it is absolutely unconscionable that we would sit here and believe that we as a city, and I'm going to put it on us as a city, did all that we could do in prioritizing our children during this pandemic and their education, such that we can ask 6th graders to show up in, I don't care if it's October or November, for such a high stakes assessment and perform at grade level, competing for seats with kids who have been in private schools and other types of schools since March of 2020 every day. Let's get real.
The hill is getting higher.
No, it's not. No, it is not.
Yeah, let me respond, please. I have indicated that then I would ask, how do you determine grade level readiness for handling the work at the exam schools if you do not have a threshold equivalent to what generally we agreed to a year ago was B or better? How do you then determine the readiness of the pool? You're not doing those students who are below grade level any, you're not giving them any assistance in being able to do the work there. So how are you going to determine the readiness of the applicant pool unless you're suggesting everybody should take the test? Or everybody should be included with their GPA. You're going to run into the same problem that you just discussed with determining the GPA. It's the same issue.
I do not agree, but I don't want to take up all the airtime. I've made it clear where I stand on this. Dr. Tung, Mr. Acevedo, Mr. Kreger.
Yeah, the hill has gotten higher.
I very much agree with Ms. Sullivan that, well, first of all, we know that there's never been a test that doesn't show group mean differences, whatever group you're talking about. And so when you set a cut score for eligibility, as we saw with Dr. Shepard's scatter plot, you're not going for what we're going for, which is greater inclusion. And so, of course, this fall, who are the students that have most suffered from the pandemic in terms of learning loss? It's the very ones that have the lower group mean differences. So we're going to go against our charge if we use a cut score on a test for eligibility.
Well, Listen, we can continue to have this discussion and try to reach a conclusion. We ran into the same problem last year. How is it using the grade when we then indicate that a grade point average to be included has to be B or better? Why aren't there the same issues that you're raising with a test to determine the readiness of the pool?
Mr. Acevedo, then Mr. Kreger.
May I suggest this in the name of, actually, in the name of not, losing the forest for the tree. And the forest, for me, is every year beyond fall of 2021. So I think it'll be easier, and we were tantalizingly close to getting to consensus for the forest, which is every year beyond fall of 2022. The tree is fall of 2021. We were able to navigate this with respect to what we were, I thought we came up with an elegant solution of phasing in and using the grade revisions for the following year, precisely because we thought it was impracticable. We agreed that it was impracticable to phase them in this year. I would agree. I mean, with this, I do agree, Mr. Compton-Passos, that this year, particularly for kids in the district, I wish we could say differently. I wish I could say that the kids in the Boston public school system had the same opportunity for grade level work and education throughout this pandemic that their private school or even charter school colleagues did. The truth is that they didn't. The truth is that the playing field isn't level and decidedly against BPS students. What I might suggest, and here's a radical thought, and I think it would also pass constitutional muster. And I know that soon we'll be deferring to Mr. Kreger, who's much closer to his law degree than I am. But I think constitutionally, we can still call this a pandemic year. Heck, if there were pandemic concerns in the summer of 2020, going into the fall of 2020, when BPS had just experienced a spring, it was just a spring. It was just a spring that we had lost to a pandemic. This year, the entire academic year, fall and spring, 20 to 21, was clouded in the pandemic. So I suggest, first of all, to move our focus to the forest, 22 and beyond. But as we consider fall of 2021, I could, with a straight face, say to Boston, this was what we did for the fall of 2020 was as a consequence of the pandemic. So extend to this year that same sort of thinking for fall of 2021, precisely because the same or worse conditions existed for students. Now, with one exception, and I'm, just to for the sake of accuracy, one of the conditions we were talking about in the summer of 2020 is we didn't think it was safe for students, literally physically safe for students to sit in the Heinz Convention Center or in the auditorium of, you know, of the Curley and take an assessment. That condition that condition isn't on the table. We don't believe that it's we don't believe that it's a physical peril now. At least science isn't telling us that, and DESE isn't telling us that. But the academic havoc is much more pronounced this year than it was last year. The academic upheaval is worse now than it was during our working group initiative. So it may be easier to think fall 22 and beyond, and then come back and think what is fair and equitable, calling the dice what they are. And the dice are saying this was a hard pandemic year for Boston Public Schools, and we need to, we need to take that into account. I think we could protect consensus by working backwards, and and maybe even outright, Mr. Contrepas and Ms. Sullivan, separating literally. So let's just decide if we're phasing it anyway. Let's think in terms of phases, and let's work on. It may be easier to work on the second phase first, and then come back and decide, well, then what would be fair and equitable for this first phase coming in to fall of 2021, the tree rather than the forest.
Mr. Krager?
So I just want to actually, I do want to react to that. So Mr. Acevedo, thank you for that thinking. And I agree with you. So I appreciate you putting that into the space. Matt.
Well, it's easy now. Yeah, I agree with Sam too. But let me say two other things. When we're trying to make sense of what to do for this year, and maybe we figure this out later, but I don't think this was ideal, but invitations this year didn't go out until the end of April. Now that's too late, especially for families that have to make plans about this, that, and the other. Right, but I think it at the very least leaves open the possibility that if there is an exam for next year, it's not administered until 2022. Right. Similarly, I think we could re-examine the idea from Dr. Shepard that without having it be a formal letter of recommendation from a teacher, perhaps a teacher could have a sense of whether a student is ready for grade level work for 1 year. These are possibilities, but perhaps our attention is best placed, as Pastor Acevedo said, on the next year so that we can come back and figure out this one.
Mr. Acevedo, is your hand up or?
No, I'm just too lazy to put it down. So sorry.
I guess I'm still holding out here.
Ms. Lum has her hand up, Mr. Contrepas.
Okay, Ms. Lum.
Not that we have gone there yet, but Mr. Krager raised the idea of the qualitative criteria that might be used. I would just want assurances that bias and any potential other judgments, conscious or unconscious, being made are, how do we assure that that is not coming into play when it comes to teacher recommendations or school recommendations? I feel like if you already have that bias built into the grading system, there's no way you can ensure that a qualitative measure would be free of such bias. And to Ms. Sullivan's earlier point about tests being mired in structured racism, I would say the entire education system has been built on that premise to begin with, and we're the birthplace of public education, so let's own it. It all started here. Boston Latin was founded a year before Harvard. this is not this 400 plus years of history cannot be solved by this task force. And we have cards that we are dealt with. And I would say we are better off focusing on what is being taught in school or what is not being taught in school to address the issues, as opposed to trying to, and hopefully that in itself of itself will help inform testing and tests to be more comprehensive, because I think a test in and of itself is race neutral. It should be race neutral. It's the testers and who created the questions and the assessments that are should be historically credited with the biases that have been built into testing. But if there is a way to create, I don't know, some level playing field at the curriculum level, which is outside of the purview of this task force, I think that's where some of that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. I have a question. How are we going to assess the readiness of the pool? Are we going to use the grade point average as we did last year? Be a better, signed off by all of the folks that give those grades, that the students are at grade level?
What happened this year? I heard Katie or someone, one of the school leaders. Okay, Tanya, you can
Yeah.
go. What happened?
So they did go by GPA, but it wasn't all of the GPAs, I don't believe. So I'll say that.
Okay.
I do not believe they were not qualified in terms of, I don't want to say the word, use the word, the grades were not verified, excuse me. So they were not, so the grades so a B didn't necessarily mean that a student was performing at grade level or beyond.
Okay. So
because there were different program types.
So the verification that we recommended as a working group and that the school committee voted on
did not happen.
Is that absolute across Boston Public Schools or absolute across all students who received invitation?
The only thing that I can say is that in terms of what I've seen so far is for BPS.
Okay. All right. So that's an operational, I'm trying to find a nice word to say, but that is, so operationally, the process did not work the way it was supposed to work.
Correct. And so that brings the question, like, how do we verify that the GPAs equal grade level performance?
So I hear that. And so I just want to make sure that I understood, because we wrestled with this question last summer. I just want to make sure that I understood kind of where the issue is. And it sounds like it's an operational issue. And so the question that I would have, and this is whether there's an assessment or whatever we're using, quite frankly, I do want to understand what the process will be for BPS to be ready to implement the recommendations, especially as it relates to verification, because that should happen regardless.
But Tanisha, I do want to say that does not mean that the same is not true for students outside of BPS.
Thank you. Yes, that is correct.
It's important to just have that in the notes.
Thank you. That's right. That's right.
May I offer yet a third possibility? Seems that I'm sort of trying to move down the hill more so than lots of other folks. I don't know, Ms. Sullivan, what it would take to get you to approve for an assessment, but I've already moved off of the assessment counting.
Well, let me just clarify. Let me stop you right there.
Okay,
I never said I was opposed to an assessment. No one's ever heard.
okay, well,
No,
I,
one- no, wait, 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 let me finish.
Good.
No one has ever heard me state that. Other people may make assumptions about where I stand relative to an assessment, but I have never, not
No,
yet,
that's-
taken a
okay.
position as it relates to utilizing an assessment in this process.
I thought I heard you say that you would not be comfortable with an assessment with this year's class.
That is not what I stated. I actually, what I put on the table was using growth. And when you use growth, when you measure growth, you are using an assessment.
Okay, and we've, I think, expressed some concern about using growth this year for a whole host of reasons, which, we may agree or disagree on. But when I initially opened this, I said that we'd have an absolute score that would be graded. I have moved from that to defining a threshold that suggests that the student is at B or better. I don't know how you're going to get there with the GPA and still not have the problems that we all struggled with last year around using the GPA alone to determine not only readiness, but the rank of the student. And so let me offer a third option in the spirit of trying to reach consensus, because the hill is just as high for me about the need for an assessment. I want to make that clear. And so if that's not the case, I don't know where we're going to go with this, but let me offer a third option. That we look at the assessment, as I've indicated before, to determine the grade level readiness of the students, all of the students, that would be the equivalent of what we did last year for B or better, to get into the applicant pool. And I've stated why I don't think it's healthy given what is required of those students at the three schools, but we can debate that. Then why don't I further try to reach consensus that in addition, since it will not count other than to determine the readiness, that a student who takes the test, all of the students in my mind should take the test, that if they do not reach grade level equivalent on the threshold and they do get grade level equivalent on the GPA, they enter the pool. That's about as far as I can go. And again, the absence of an assessment is not acceptable to me, period.
Mr. Acevedo, I see you. And acknowledge, yes.
I suggest, and this is just going back to my comment earlier, I guess the question for you, Mr. Contreras, and I guess I'm just going to try to be the guy to stick here, is for which year. So I strongly suggest that we park the fall of 2021. It's so easy to think we need to come up with a solution for the fall of 2021 because it is June of 2021. I suggest the easier way, sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points isn't a straight line. And I think the easier way to get to the fall of 2021 is to focus on the fall of 2022 and then come back to the fall of 2021. And I don't, gosh, I'm full of mixed metaphors. We're not building Rome in a day, or Boston. I think there'll be plenty of work on this on Monday, but you asked the question, what about this plan or what about that plan? What, they sound great, Mr. C. We'll have to work through these, but I strongly suggest, urge, my verbs only are going to get more intense from that point on, that we ignore. How's that? Here's another verb. Fall of 2021 for now. Focus on the fall of 2022, and then come back to the harder question on the exam, which is the fall of 2021. I think by then, magically, somehow, it's going to, the solution's going to fall on our lap. But I think it'll be a lot easier, especially at 7:24 p.m.
On a
for
Friday.
us to just
On a Friday with
the reason why we're here tonight, folks, is because it's a hill for all of us, and this is Iwo Jima, and we got to win it.
Yep, I agree.
So can
we
I
gotta
just
win it? That's why we're here.
Can I just jump in
So
really?
one second. Time. Let me just call out kind of what we're going to do here. So, Mr. Acevedo, thank you for your comments. I am going to go to Dr. Freeman Wisdom, then to Ms. Grassa, and then I'd like to pause the conversation so we can get to public comment. So we can
Sounds
hear
like a
from,
plan.
because perhaps the solution is among our attendees.
There you go.
Right. Thank you. I promise to be quick. I want to say first that the work is hard. But sometimes we have to lean into the hard work, and I don't want to do what's easiest just because it's most convenient. That's number one. Number two is that I do like Mr. Craig's suggestion in terms of why do we have to have a test in November? Why I'm not opposed. This is just me. I am a proponent of a test, but I'm not opposed to doing it in the spring. To give more time for students to quote unquote get back into the rhythm of things, because I believe that when you have learners, we may have gaps in times in terms of how we were learning and the context in which we were learning, but I think that the innate ability and the skill is still there. It's never, I don't believe that it's lost. So I'm not opposed to postponing the exam until later in the school year. And that was suggested. It would just be a matter of how quick of a turnaround we can get the results of those assessments so that families can make an informed decision. But I'm not opposed to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman Wisdom. And Ms. Grass, I see you took your hand down, and I'm assuming that's so we could go to public comment. Got it. Perfect. So then let's do that. Ms. Parvex, can we invite our attendees?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. We have 17 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. I will remind you when you have 20 seconds left. Please state your name, affiliation, and what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Also, make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. I will move you up as a panelist, and we will ask you to turn on your camera for public comment. Our first speaker this evening is Suri Yang, followed by Shanggu Shi and Lisa Green. Suri Yang. Please turn on your camera and unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Sarah Yang, and I am a 6th grade student from West Roxbury. I will be talking about the flaws in using only GPA. Determining entry into the BLS with only GPA has many faults. The problem with GPA is that humans are not objective, they are subjective, so there may be bias. There's also not a specific criteria every teacher must follow, so they may rate things differently, and some teachers are harsher than others. In many schools, you also have to do group projects. The problem with this is that group projects grading can be inaccurate, as people commonly split up work in a group project, especially when there's a large amount of work. And a group member may not be as hardworking and put less effort on their work. And the only way to have your to save your grade is to do the other person's work. Another reason using only GPA isn't fair is that some schools may use different systems for grading other than BPS grading. The reason this is a problem is that they may be converted wrong. I used to go to schools in the town Melrose, which use a different grading system. And when they converted it to BPS grading, it was converted wrong. On my 4th grade MCAS and my 6th grade MAP testing, I was among the top 10%. Yet I was informed that I was at the bottom 20% when the result came, which didn't make sense considering my past scores on tests. An alternative for all GPA is using half, 1/3, or a quarter GPA, and the rest being another or more factors, such as tests, in order
20 seconds left.
The more factors, the easier it is to corroborate and figure out a student's skill. We should not use GPA as the only factor for getting into the BLS, as it can be inaccurate and unfair. Instead, we should try to get a more accurate policy to ensure the system is just.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Xianggu Shi or Eric Shi. Please raise your hand. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. And I just want to talk about two things. The first thing is about to share my dream. Second, share my recent conversation with my son, who is an AWC student but failed in getting into any of those exam schools. So first thing is about my dream. So I had many dreams, but now I only have one dream. I hope the exam schools in Boston are real exam schools. No additional conditions like zip code, right? Zip code is not a solution. It is a discrimination. Second, I had a lot of conversations, because I try to comfort my kid, right? So who was really frustrated, and he worked so hard, he couldn't get in any of those exam schools. But he asked me who's on the task force. I said, most of them are working hard for fairness, not working for their own political interest or interest. He said, Daddy, are you kidding? And then we talk a lot, right? And then he asked me why some of those task force members resigned due to scandals, right? And then, but I cannot answer all these questions. I just randomly, pick up some of you. Maybe you can help answer my kid's question. For example, Mrs. Sullivan, can you help answer all these questions? Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Lisa Green. Lisa Green. Lisa Green, there. Could you please turn on your camera and unmute yourself? Thank you. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Lisa Green. I'm a BLS parent from the North End. I'm here to read a statement on behalf of the Boston Coalition for Education Equity, an alliance of 14 civil rights, education, and community organizations from across the city. The push to diversify Boston exam school enrollment is a vital part of the citywide movement against structural racism. It must move forward so that future classes of exam school students more closely reflect Boston's student population as a whole. We strongly oppose any calls to disband the Exam School Admissions Task Force and urge the task force to complete its work and make its recommendation to the school committee by the end of June so that the committee can take action and the new admissions process can get underway. The admissions process used this year resulted in significant improvement in the geographic, socioeconomic, racial, and language diversity of students in the 3 schools. The A- average GPA for this year's accepted students proves that Boston can have an admissions process that is more equitable while maintaining high academic standards. But it was a 1-year measure. This task force was charged with devising a long-term way to increase diversity at the schools while maintaining rigor. Task force members have spent many long hours reviewing data, studying the experience of other cities, listening to students and parents, and coming up with a number of viable approaches. Now, some defenders of the old system of admissions for exam schools want to stop the task force from putting forward its recommendations. Not holding a vote or delaying the vote would be a reassertion of the racist systems that have long denied access to these schools for Black and Latinx students, English learners, and students with disabilities. Proposals for change are threatening to many white families with privilege and resources who have benefited from past admissions policies that unfairly discriminated against and harmed Black and brown students. If city leaders are to make good on their repeated pledges to make Boston an anti-racist city, this year's progress must be preserved, improved upon, and made permanent. We thank the task force for its work and look forward to hearing your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is James Noonan. And please slow down a little bit when you speak. I know it's hard because you have only 2 minutes, but our interpreters are working hard. Thank you. James Noonan. Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is James Noonan. I'm a parent of 2 BPS students and a resident of Roxbury. I'm also an assistant professor of education at Salem State and associate director of research for the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. Last October, I offered testimony in support of the temporary exam schools policy, and tonight I want to express my support for a permanent policy that incorporates and even extends those changes. While I agree that some adjustments to the policy may be warranted, for example, I'd support replacing median family income with a more precise measure of poverty, and I'd urge you against using raw or cut scores on high-stakes standardized tests. I believe the temporary policy premising eligibility on grades and using measures of income and geography alongside academic measures to make admissions decision resulted in significant strides towards greater equity, and I think we should not forget that. Under the temporary policy across all 3 exam schools, this year's admitted class includes more students from the Boston public schools as opposed to charter, parochial, and private schools. The percentage increase this year of admitted 7th grade students who are Black was 87.5% at BLA and 183.3% at BLS. And among last year's 7th grade cohort, 33.1% came from neighborhoods with a median family income over $100,000. This year, a similar percentage, 33.8%, came from neighborhoods with a median family income under 50. The task force is in a unique position. You're designing a policy that can acknowledge and begin to unwind the vast educational inequalities in the city, which will require getting the criteria and the measures right, which is difficult. But I think we know enough not to go backwards. And quickly, in terms of the fall 21-22 question, I think I'd like to suggest carrying over the temporary policy in full for another year with a push to verify grades. This continuity acknowledges the challenges of having sit for a test and then ensures that next year's class isn't seen as a less rigorous anomaly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Geo Pfeiffer. I don't see anyone with that name. Geo Pfeiffer, if you're there, please raise your hand. Otherwise, Peggy Wiesenberg. Peggy, please. Oh, there. Please unmute yourself. I can.
Good evening. One, I want to thank all members of the task force and confess that I've tried to follow these proceedings and recognize the difficulty of the issues. I live in Jamaica Plain. My 3 children attended BPS K to 12. My daughters entered Latin school from the MLK Middle School, now the King K-8. My son from the Mission Hill School. My middle daughter was in the last BLS class to be invited based on rank-ordered ISEE scores, student choice, and the district's racial fairness guidelines prior to the court ruling in the McLaughlin case. And in graduating, she described her graduating class of 2002 as follows. For centuries, Boston Latin was a school for young men, but the class of 2002 has been defined by energetic women leaders, a woman editor of the Argo, 4 women editors-in-chief of the Register, all female class committee, of which 7 of the 11 elected representatives are African-American women. We've emerged, we have immigrated to this country from all over the world. We come from, and she said, called out Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, Hyde Park, Reedville, West Roxbury, Roslindale, Back Bay, Fenway, the South End, Chinatown, Allston, Brighton, South Boston, East Boston, etc. The fairest proposal under consideration seems to be a weighted lottery system of qualified applicants with B or higher GPA for 6th grade coursework next fall and 5th and 6th grade coursework for future years, dividing the applicants for available 7th grade seats into 8 tiers or pools of students. I will send in my testimony, but I do have questions about how you plan to use some of this information that you're talking about. So thank you, and I'm sorry we're short on time.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Jess Madden Foco. I think she had to leave. Amy Gusevsky. Jeffrey Klog. Jeffrey. Sharon Hinton. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Sharon Hinton. I'm a parent, educator, community activist, Hyde Park resident, and president of Black Teachers Matter Incorporated. Thank you, Exam School Task Force, for what you've done and continue to do in your work towards equality, education, and equity in the admissions process at the 3 exam schools. Earlier today, I heard Mr. Contompassis and Ms. Sullivan summarize the task put before them, first as a working group and now as a task force. I appreciate their efforts and have the experiential knowledge and institutional memory to understand what a huge undertaking this task actually is. However, let us not lose sight of what is really at stake here, namely the dismantling of a system of white supremacy and institutional racism that has eliminated or marginalized the educational aspirations and academic opportunities of generations of Black and Brown, disabled, poor white and or non-English speaking, equally intelligent and brilliant young people who, through no fault of their own, were born in a different place, race, ethnicity, income bracket, or neighborhood. All parents want the best education and opportunities for their children. All students want to succeed in school and life. All schools should have what the exam schools, private schools, and charter schools offer. But even after Brown versus Board of Education, Judge Arthur Garrity, Metco, and countless superintendents, school committees, elected officials, and lawsuits, here we are again, and we don't get a do-over with our kids. I believe what the Exam School Task Force is doing is another step in the right direction for now. Granted, it is taking too long, and for many of us, enough already. While BPS schools are crumbling, the minds and futures of our children are a terrible thing to waste.
20 seconds left.
To the parents who stated in Boston School Committee meetings that they feel if the exam schools allow other zip codes into the admission process will lower academic standards and rigors, shame on you. The elitism of exam schools should be abolished altogether, I believe. To those parents, students, teachers, advocates, coalitions, and elected officials who are standing together towards a quality education in every school, keep standing. We shall overcome because the people united will never be defeated. Thank you for continuing to be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Andrew Illiff. I don't see anyone with that name. So we'll go to Domingos da Rosa. Domingos da Rosa. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. Thank you.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Domingos da Rosa. I'm an activist here in Boston. I live in Hyde Park. I'd like to thank everyone for the ongoing effort on working on this issue. This issue has gone for a long time. As a BPS grad, class of '96, Madison Park, this was an ongoing conversation I and several classmates have always had for years on end. One, we actually never knew about the exam schools, which for me was always an issue to come find out, in my junior year of high school that I had other options besides the one that were given to me. To remove this exam process will help shorten the achievement gap here in Boston. A lot of the suggestions made tonight and over the several months are great suggestions. A lot of the suggestions are the solutions to the issue. But what we fail to do is interact with the youngest folks who are going to be affected, the ones who are going to be the students at BLA in the near future. If we continue to have these conversations and do not include the individuals who are actually going to sit down and take these exams or have to produce the GPAs to be able to be a part of the conversation within BLA and Latin Academy and O'Brien, we're not really going to get to the end result. We need to be able to make this more transparent, not only with elected officials, the school committee, the mayor, and individuals like myself who have interest in this great issue, but to make sure that the students that we are speaking of to be a part of this. 8% Blacks students attend BLA, and that shouldn't be. 3% of white students attend Madison Park. That shouldn't be. We also can add Madison Park to this conversation. As you know, it's another school that should be a part of the exam schools to make sure that everyone has an opportunity. Thank you, guys. Have a great night.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Christina Yang. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good. So thank you, everyone. Good evening. My name is Christina Yang, parent of a current BPS 6th grader from West Roxbury. First of all, I would like to thank everyone on the task force for your diligence and your hard work. My husband and I came to US 16 years ago to pursue our dreams with strong beliefs in 3 core American values, which are independence, hard work, and equality. So through years of unthinkable hard work, we succeeded and have been making significant contributions to improve patients' lives. Similar to most first-generation Asian American immigrants, we do not inherit any legacies from our families, and therefore has no privileges to preserve. We achieve everything we have today by overcoming countless obstacles and challenges, culturally, intellectually, and financially. And we also teach our kids to follow exactly the same values that help us succeed. Some people said Asian American kids excel because their affluent middle-class families can afford expensive education enrichment opportunities. That statement is one-sided and overlook what are really behind. Did they see our Asian parents more than 100% of dedication and devotion behind this, regardless if they're blue collars or white collars? That's numerous years, no matter sun, rain, or snow, of fetching kids to Chinese school, orchestra, sports teams, and all sorts of enrichment programs, In addition to the time spent on closely monitoring kids' homework and progress at school. We are responsible and dedicated parents, not the parents trying to game the system. We are devoted because we respect the rule of playing the fair game. This should not become the excuses we Asian Americans are being excluded from the opportunities we should have earned. How can you call an admission policy equitable and race neutral when 70% of Chinatown students and 50% of Asian exam schools this year?
Ms. Yang, the 2 minutes are up.
Okay, thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker is Rachel Meiselman.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Rachel Meiselman. I am an alumna of Boston Latin School. In the previous testimonies, I have expressed concern over the one-year admission policy for the exam schools. Tonight, however, I want to articulate my concerns over the raison d'etre of the exam schools admissions task force itself. I've listened to Mr. Krager discuss his desire to see efforts put into place to ensure that no student feels isolated, which assumes racism in these storied institutions, without providing concrete examples. I've witnessed an impromptu backslapping session over an increase in linguistic diversity. As a gentle reminder, the exam schools admit students without regard to race, ethnicity, a socioeconomic status. Nonetheless, there is an expectation. Students must perform at an accelerated academic level, and they must carry a heavy workload. There, however, seems to be a push to nudge the curricula from a focus on theoretical and practical knowledge to perceptions and emotions. Equally, there appears to be little or no recognition of the difficulties that can arise from language barriers. There was an increase in the admissions of ELA learners from levels 3 and 4, the students of which have not always attained fluency in the English language, yet there does not appear to be any supports in place for these students. I also want to make abundantly clear that an admission to one of the exam schools represents a culmination of hard work. It is evidence of a solid acquisition of a certain set of skills. So any diversity cannot possibly be achieved from the top down. Hence, the feeder schools must be fixed. Where is the task force on this? Where is energy to address the issues that plague them? And I would like to say that there are 2 schools on Methadone Mile, which has been described as a war zone. And according to a 2020 state audit, roughly 1/3 of the schools, I will finish up. I'm sorry, Ms. Parvex, attend schools that are ranked in the bottom 10% of the state. There were even concerns about state intervention.
So, Ms. Meiselman, actually, Ms. Parvex has indicated that your time is up.
Some members of which.
Thank you. Next, just a second. Next speaker is Kevin Murray. Kevin Murray, please raise your hand. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Kevin Murray, Executive Director of Mass Advocates for Children and a former BPS parent from Roslindale. MAC has not typically involved itself in discussions concerning Boston's selective admission schools because the vast majority of the families we work with in Boston aren't even part of that discussion. That, of course, is exactly why we feel we need to be part of this discussion. I come tonight to make 2 points. One is that words matter. By allowing yourselves to be called the Exam School Task Force, you're projecting an internalized answer to one of the key questions you seek to address. If these are exam schools, then the question is, how can we make an exam work more equitably? For us, that is not the question. These are elite selective admissions public schools. And the question is, what changes regarding access to these schools can create more equity across the entire Boston Public Schools? That leads me to point 2. Anyone who's been around BPS for any length of time knows that this discussion is not about 3 schools. It's about the myriad ways in which the concentration of resources and attention on 3 schools and ultimately 1 school, and equities in the access to those schools impacts the educational experience of every one of the 55,000 children in the system. Grade configuration, parents' choices, school closings, school budgets, student assessments, language access. The inequities you are addressing here make ripples, no waves, that extend to every corner of the system. Whether or not my neighbor's child is going to get into BLS is, of course, part of the story, but the story is so much more complicated than that. And so it is that you work with the eyes of the entire city on you. I ask that you turn old and new pressures into an even stronger motivation to finish the job that you've begun so well.
2 minutes are up.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to address the task force to face systemic impacts of unequal access to Boston's selective admissions public schools.
Thank you.
Buenas noches.
Next speaker is Sharon Kuntz. Sharon, I don't see you. Okay. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Hi, sorry, I think my internet glitched out for a second. Can you see me?
Yeah, no, we can't see you.
Let me see.
There.
Better? Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Sorry. Hi, thanks for the opportunity to testify, and thanks so much for all of your hard work. I thought I had a sense, but listening to the work that was going on this evening really gave me an even greater appreciation for the task that you all are undertaking on behalf of greater equity in Boston Public Schools, which is super important to me as a parent who's just entering the school system. I didn't grow up in Boston. My kids are in first and K1. And it's really disturbing to me, to Mr. Murray's point just now, how much focus is placed on these exam schools. And it's really painful to see parents, Asian, Black, Latinx, white, like fighting with each other over scraps, right? Like all BPS kids should have access to top quality high schools. And for that reason, in part, I really want to urge that you make the bar as low as possible to ensure that students admitted to the exam schools are able to do the work and excel there, and then make it a lottery, because I think that is what will generate the political will to really address inequities throughout the system, including but not limited to the exam schools. Finally, I want to push back on the idea of an assessment as some kind of objective measure, because my personal experience as someone who was a good test taker in school, but who also knew people who, you know, we all know like there's private tutors and all these services. So a test is not an objective measure. And finally, to agree with Mr. Acevedo that if it's at all possible to come to a consensus, please do. I mean, you all know it's getting really ugly out here in terms of the community response. So if, you know, to the extent that you guys can present a united front, that would be helpful. I think the worst case scenario is that nothing changes. And again, just thank you for your service and for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, we have a Cantonese speaker, but it's Shirley Sheng Wang, but I don't see her. So I think that concludes our speakers for tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Parvex. Mr. Condompasis, are we prepared to entertain a motion to adjourn? You're on mute.
Here we go. I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I so move.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
A second.
Thank you. Any discussion or objection to the
Wait,
motion?
did Sam move and second?
No.
No,
Oh.
Matt
That was
second.
Mr.
Matt
Krager.
second.
Mr. Krager moved, I second.
Mr. Krager second.
Okay.
I was watching.
Either way, I'm good.
Ms. Parvex, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Mr. Acevedo,
Aye.
Mr. Kreger,
Aye.
Ms. Freeman, Dr. Freeman Wisdom,
Aye.
Ms. Grassa, Ms. Lam,
Aye.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Aye.
Dr. Tang. Oh, sorry. Ms. Sullivan
Aye.
and Mr. Contreras.
All right. Thank you all for hanging in. This is not easy. We'll keep pushing.
Have a great
And
weekend,
we'll-
everybody.
Yep. Happy weekend. We'll see you Monday, I guess.
Indeed.
Take care.
Thank you all, and thank you to the interpreters.